So my name is Ali Torres, and I'm with Trepepi Smith, the marketing consulting firm that is working with the city to educate residents on their by-district elections. And then on the call, we also have Dr. Justin Levitt, who is with National Demographics Corporation, and he is a part of the firm that is one of the premier demographers in the state. And then we also have your own assistant city manager, Brian King. And Brian, I will pass it over to you to say a few words and kick us off here.
Thank you, Allison. Again, my name is Brian King, assistant city manager. And just on behalf of the entire Irvine City Council and city manager Oliver Chi, I just want to say thank you all for joining us to learn more about expansion of our city council and the assignment of district seats. This is an exciting time for our city, and I'm glad you're here to participate in the democratic process of our community. As Allison indicated, we sought the services of National Demographic Corporation to help us through this process. They've helped upwards of 180 agencies throughout the state go through this, and we're just excited to have their expertise and assistance to get us through this very important process. But more importantly, we're just glad you're engaged and listening and a part of this. And if you can, please pass the word along to your friends and neighbors. We're holding a series of these forums throughout the process. Many more to come. Please check out the website. And anyway, they're going to talk about all that. I'll stop, but just excited for your participation and engagement. Thanks, Allison.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. And then with that, we'll cover a few of today's goals. First and foremost, you do have the opportunity with you being here on this webinar or all of the forums that you are able to join. You have the opportunity to learn from the demographer expert, Justin, who will answer all of your questions and be able to provide all of the insight on what districting is. And you also have a few people from the city side that are available to answer some questions if you have any regarding the city's process. And then you also have myself be here to answer any questions regarding outreach that you may have. And then with that, Justin will cover the mapping tools that are available to you currently on the drawirvine.org website. And you'll be able to use those tools to create your own maps for council consideration. And your feedback is incredibly important to us because you also know your neighborhoods and communities best, and you'll be able to provide feedback to Justin on the city, on the communities that you're in, and be able to help us identify communities that should be kept together when drawing the district lines. And most importantly, the most important goal of tonight is that we want you to leave here feeling empowered to give the most effective feedback you can and be able to participate in this process. And we also want to make sure that we provide you with information, tools, and resources that you need to be able to draw the maps and hopefully be able to submit them to council consideration. And then with that, another important question that we also want to answer tonight is why you should get involved. Frankly, democracy works better when everyone is involved and is participating in this civic process. And you'll be able to weigh in on important matters that affect residents, businesses, owners, or visitors that come into the city of Irvine. You are the experts, just as I mentioned, of your community and neighborhoods. And just as I said, no one knows Irvine or your villages or your neighborhoods better than you. And so you'll be able to let us know because of X, Y, and Z, this reason, we should keep this specific community in one district. And last but not least, this process was also a once-in-a-decade opportunity, and your participation will help shape the city of Irvine for the next about 10 years here. And then covering a bit of today's schedule, we will have Justin review the process rules and goals, and he'll also go over the mapping tools. And then we'll also turn it back to you all as the community members, and you'll be able to provide us your specific neighborhoods, your communities of interest, and what you would like to see in a district moving forward. And then we'll also have some next steps here that Justin will also cover. And that will take us to about 7:30 p.m. And again, as I mentioned, this recording will be posted to the drawirvine.org website, which is our dedicated districting website, if you want to continue to watch and learn moving forward. And then with that, I will pass it over to Justin to take us into the meat of the presentation.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And I'm actually going to start by taking a small step back because whether or not these districts are used until 2030 is ultimately not going to be just a determination of the process through here tonight, but also through your vote next March. Because the background to what we're looking at doing here is that the council is placing an amendment to the city charter on the March 2024 ballot that would increase the size of the city council from 5 members, as it currently is, to 7 members. 6 of the 7 seats would be elected by district, and the mayor would continue to be elected at large. So this districting process, whatever the result of it is, will be put up for a citywide vote in March. And if passed, then those districts would be used for the next until the 2030 election, until the 2031 redistricting. However, this will ultimately be up to you to decide. Now, what do we mean when we talk about elections and districts? Let's go to the next slide. California offers cities a choice of 3 methods of election. The at-large system of elections is what we currently have. Essentially, all residents of the city get to vote for all the council members, and council members can reside anywhere in the city. This means they could all live in one neighborhood, or they could live spread out throughout the community. What a by-district system of elections would mean is that instead of all living in one part of the city, council members would reside in a particular portion of the city, and only the voters who live within that portion of the city would be able to vote for that council member. This is kind of the way we elect members to Congress or the state legislature, to the county board of supervisors, and more recently to our school districts as well. Now, there is another system of elections used by a couple of our neighbors. The from districts or residence district system was used by Santa Ana for over 50 years until this next election, or last election, and currently is still used by the city of Newport Beach. However, this system is subject to a California Voting Rights Act challenge. And so rather than face that, the council decided to go directly to looking at a by-district system. I do want to emphasize that this is not being driven by the California Voting Rights Act. This is being driven by the council that wants to put the option of expanding the council and adding 2 new seats to the council up to you, the voters of the city of Irvine. If we go to the next slide, we can see just the extent of this change. In 2010, they were just 1 city in the county. The tiny city of Seal Beach, actually my former town I lived in, was the only city that had by-district elections in 2010. Santa Ana and Newport Beach used this from district system, and every other city in the county was elected at large. Today, all but a handful of cities elect by district, all the way from Buena Park and Fullerton in the north end of the city or county to Dana Point and San Juan Capistrano at the south. Even Santa Ana switched from this at-large or from this from district system to the by-district system a few years ago. Irvine is now the largest city in the state that does not have by-district elections. And that, among other factors, was one of the reasons why the council is looking at putting this on the ballot for you to decide. I will mention that if the voters don't approve of this council expansion, then you will continue to elect at large. If we go to the next slide, I want to talk through a little bit about the process, because the districting process works the same whether we're looking at putting something on the ballot or implementing something directly. What we're looking at doing essentially is in 2 stages, and we're still in the first part. The first part of the process is about educating and informing the community that districting is happening and giving you the tools you need to participate in this process. We had our first public hearing on April 11th, and our second public hearing in front of the council is scheduled on May 9th. This is your opportunity to address the council directly about the districting process, about the composition of districts, which areas need to stay together. In addition, we're holding a series of workshops. So we're about halfway through the series of workshops between April 15th and May 27th. This round of workshops basically is giving us the opportunity to demo the tool, to answer your questions, and to learn more about the communities and neighborhoods that make up the city. We've already seen several people come out of these workshops and submit their own maps or their own ideas. And we hope that you, after listening today, will also feel able and empowered to do that as well. Let's go stay on that slide for a bit. Go back to the slide. Yeah. This round ends June 29th. Or I should say it doesn't end June 29th, but at least that's the first deadline. If you want your map to be considered at the third public hearing on July 11th, that's the deadline we need your maps in by. This is really driven by the state. The state requires that we post maps 7 days in advance of the third public hearing. This gives us a window to make sure we can draw it in and that everyone in the community is able to view and respond to your map in a clear and cohesive way. The second round really focuses in on the maps themselves. We start to look at the individual options, the trade-offs, and narrowing the process down, perhaps even combining maps or eliminating maps that really don't work at all. Our first hearing in this round is July 11th, and then we're going to go back out to the community. And between July and September, we're holding another round of workshops to get feedback on those first maps. This is all with the intention of a second public hearing, or actually I guess will be technically the fourth public hearing on September 12th to present revised maps. And then the council will make its final decision on or after October 10th. And as I mentioned before, the map selection is not the end of the process. This map will then go to the ballot, and in March of 2024, there is a citywide vote on whether or not the map will be adopted, on whether or not the council expansion will happen. If voters approve this charter amendment, the first by-district election would take place in November. If not approved, at-large elections would continue. The map, however it is picked, will be used through the 2030 election. In 2030, we'll be taking the next census and using those new census data points that'll come out in early 2031. The city will have to revisit its district boundaries and will have the chance to make changes now with a few elections under its belt. So essentially, our process is really just in the early stages. And so it's a great time to begin to get involved. And if we go to the next slide now, we're looking at this round of workshops, which we started April 15th. We still have 2 more workshops coming up. May 13th, 3 p.m., we have the South Coast Chinese Cultural Center at 3, and then on Saturday, May 27th at 2 p.m., we will be at the Lakeview Senior Center. Each of these meetings will be another opportunity to hear your presentation, to get your questions answered, and to learn how the tools work, as well as to provide your own feedback and testimony as we look at the factors we need to consider when we're going into this map. By the way, there will be another round of workshops, so if you're not already on our mailing list, please pay attention because we're going to be coming up with another round of workshops as we go through July or August and September. And here we have our dates for the community workshops. A lot of these you'll see we're doubling up on dates just to make sure that we have the chance to reach different communities on the same days. On August 5th at the Quail Hill Community Center at 10 a.m., the South Coast Chinese Cultural Center at 2 p.m. On the 26th, we'll be at the Lakeview Senior Center at 10 a.m. and Heritage Park Library at 2 p.m. At 10 a.m. on Saturday, September 23rd, we'll be at the Great Park Artist Studio, and then in that afternoon at the City Council Chamber. We welcome you to come to all of our workshops in both rounds. to learn about the process and hear what you and other residents of your community have to say about the districting process. If we go on to the next slide, I want to move a little bit into the rules and goals that we use for the districting process. This is really at the heart of the districting process as a whole. Now, we divide this up into 3 columns based on where these criteria or rules come from. The left-hand column are federal laws. These are things that the Supreme Court requires us to look at and consider. And first and foremost is equal population. This is the one person, one vote principle, that all the districts have to have more or less the same number of total residents. And this is total, includes everyone. It includes children, it includes non-citizen, it includes it includes those, many people staying in university or other temporary locations during that census count. We don't have to get to perfectly equal. It's okay if our districts vary a little bit, as we'll talk about in a couple slides. The ideal population is supposed to be about 51,000 people per district. It's okay if we have a district that's at 50,000 or 52,000, if that helps us fulfill everything else on this list. But we have to get more or less close to equal. We have a maximum allowance of what we call the 10% deviation. That's 10% difference between the largest population and the smallest population when compared to that ideal size of a district. You could think of it as about maybe 2,000 up or down, above or below that 51,000 person ideal. Second, when it comes to federal laws, is the Voting Rights Act. Now, while race cannot be the only factor or even the predominant factor in the creation of a district, protected class communities, groups that have historically faced discrimination or barriers to registration and voting, have their rights protected under federal law. And what this means is that we have to look and see whether or not we find majority communities that are protected class communities. And if so, we have to pay special attention to those areas. It doesn't mean we have to put a line in a particular place. What it does mean is that we have to really listen to and hear from those communities about where their boundaries and where their communities are. And we'll take a look at the numbers there shortly, but it is something that we're going to talk more about when we talk about communities of interest. And that really brings us nicely into the middle column. The California criteria for cities, the Fair Maps Act of 2019, requires us to consider 4 components or 4 criteria in a rank ordered way. First, contiguity is the principle that a district must have one outside boundary that all parts of the district must touch. One way that in Washington State they put it that I really think makes it clear what it really refers to is that you must be able to walk or drive from one part of the district to every other part of that same district without leaving the district. And what we're really getting at is that we don't want a little bit of the district here and a little bit of the district there, broken up in such a way that it's not one piece. And so if we see that that's something that's objective, we can measure, we'll be calling out or noting when districts are not contiguous. Second, undivided neighborhoods and communities of interest is the exact opposite. It's the most subjective of our criteria. The law defines this as socioeconomic and geographic areas that should be kept together for the purpose of their effective and fair representation. And when I say it's subjective, I don't mean that we all don't have different answers to what, to what this means, but what I'm getting at is that we all interpret what communities of interest are a little bit differently. They're based on our experience of living within a community, based on our knowledge of the community and the historical and social and cultural patterns of that community. This is where most of our debate will happen between the different maps. And that's a good thing because we want to understand and recognize where the different potential communities of interest are and what's the best way to keep together those that need to be kept together. Third, easily identifiable boundaries. This is the principle that it should be easy for voters to understand which district they reside in. So to the extent possible, if we can follow major roads, if we can follow natural boundaries like canyons or rivers where possible, to make it easy to say, oh yeah, if you live west of Jamboree or north of the 5, you're in this particular district, rather than saying, well, cross the freeway, go 1 block and then over 2 blocks, and then, you know, those zigzag patterns are not easily identifiable. And they don't have to be streets or freeways. It could be as simple as saying, follow the school district boundary. Whatever makes it easy for people to identify which district they live in. Fourth here on this list is compactness. And the Fair Maps Act defines compactness as not bypassing one group of people to get to a more distant group of people. What this means is really aimed at hooks and fingers, lines that look like they're designed or maybe are designed to get particular residences or buildings, maybe commercial properties, into a particular district. Note that these are rank ordered, so that, for example, if a community is not compact according to this definition, because it follows a canyon, because it follows a river, because it follows some other natural or man-made feature, we should keep that community together first before we worry about compactness. The Fair Maps Act also prohibits favoring or discriminating against a political party. So what that means for us is that we're not going to take into account partisanship, and council can't take into account partisanship when discussing their preferred maps. Now, I got a great question in the Q&A about age in communities of interest, and I am going to answer that question when we talk a little bit more about communities of interest on the next couple of slides, but I will get to that. So thank you very much for your question, and I will make sure to talk about that when we talk about more about communities of interest. Other traditional districting principles I want to say a word about first. Now, what we get at in this third column are things that courts have recognized that as being valid to consider. What that means is that we don't have to consider them. So, for example, respecting voters' choices is the incumbency principle that recognizes that voters of the city have elected members to the council, and that it should be up to the voters to decide whether or not those members continue, rather than the strike of a pen on the map. That is something that is perfectly okay to consider after, and only after, we consider everything in the first 2 columns, and that you may or may not choose to consider. And when I say you, it could mean you individually, or you in the broader sense of a community. This is really something that we might look at the very end of the process when we're looking at 2 maps that we think do an equally good job of everything in the first 2 columns, but one of them does slightly better, say, underpopulating an area that's going to grow more in the next 10 years. We might choose that map over the map that has an overpopulated area that will grow more in over the next 10 years. So respecting voters' choices, or the incumbency principle, and future population growth into this column. These are 2 traditional districting principles. Other factors that you might want to consider would go into this column as well. Things we can consider, but first we have to consider all the federal and state requirements. Now let's go on to the next slide. I do want to look at some of the numbers. The 2020 census, and here we're using the adjusted 2020 census count. According to the state of California, it adjusts all incarcerated persons back to their last known address. And it's the data set we are required to use when drawing districts. That data set found that Irvine had 307,958 people. And so if we divide by 6, what we get is about 51,326 people in each district. Now, remember, as I said, it's not going to be perfect. We're not going to get exactly that number in any particular seat, but that's our target. We want to get fairly close to that. Now, in addition to this data, total population data, our data set contains a lot of other really important, really good information that we're going to be referring to throughout the process. The citizen voting age population, the second block in the column on the left, that's what the courts call the eligible voter count. It's the population over the age of 18 with US citizenship. The courts use citizen voting age population rather than total population, particularly when looking at Latino and Asian American voting rights, because of the disparities in citizenship rates and age of the population. So we're going to be looking at some citizen voting age population maps here in a second. And when we look at race and ethnicity, citizen voting age population is the number the courts would constantly come back to. We do also have voter registration and turnout data from the 2020 and 2018 elections, which were the two most recently available elections available at the statewide level. The state still has not finished compiling the 2022 elections yet. These are to give you a sense of the turnout and registration differences between different districts. And then on the right-hand column, we have a lot of data from the American Community Survey. And this includes age, language spoken at home, level of education and income, and housing statistics like single and multifamily housing. This is really invaluable information from understanding nuance and detail within the community. I like to remind us ourselves that obviously new numbers don't substitute for your understanding of the community, but they can help us explain what we see and even be helped to justify where we see some of the big breaks between neighborhoods and communities. So these numbers are something that we can map and we can look at them, and we'll show you them later in this presentation on a map, and that they might be relevant. To get a question about age into consideration. Age certainly can create communities of interest around it. We often see retirement communities, areas that have a larger than average number of children at home, universities that have an age range and a very specific demographic range taken into consideration as a potential communities of interest. And we'll talk about why as we look at that definition of communities of interest in a couple slides. So we're going to definitely begin to talk about that, answer the first question, but something we're going to come back to a couple of slides, or a couple of questions later. Can we go to the next slide, please? Looking at our voting rights analysis, the areas that are in the blues and purples are under 35% Latino. So the areas in purple under 25%, the areas in the darker blue, 25 to 35% Latino. Conversely, or I say not just Latino, but the specific protected class group that's being referenced in the map. Conversely, the areas in red are over 75% members of that particular protected class group. In yellow, 65 to 75%. And so what we see in our protected class analysis is that there is a concentration of Asian Americans at the north end of the city, north of Interstate 5. That is not necessarily saying that that is a community of interest per se. It is something that we really want to hear about from the community, and some of our community events we're going to be going, for example, to the Chinese Cultural Center, but hopefully, hear from members who live in North Irvine about where the appropriate boundaries are to draw those district lines. And, like I said, just because we don't see anything, for example, most of the African-American map shows that the city is under 25% African-American, doesn't mean that there aren't communities that we can take into account as part of our discussion of communities of interest. Part of what makes a community of interest are those cultural factors that may not be picked up just by looking at the numbers alone. So we look at this for the legal analysis, for the legal side, where do we see potential issues? But this is just a starting point looking through our analysis. Let's go to the next slide, because now we can really get into neighborhoods and communities of interest. And what we'd like to think about here is that really neighborhoods and communities of interest are getting at two slightly different things. Neighborhoods are the smallest building blocks that we like to look at when drawing districts. So neighborhoods should be smaller than a single district, and oftentimes they're very clearly geographically defined. Maybe it's the planning area or the village. Certainly we've seen people describe both of those as neighborhoods. Maybe it's a university campus. Maybe it is areas that touch a particular street or a particular park or a particular commercial center. Oftentimes what makes a neighborhood is that it is a single structure or a set of structures that are built by the single developer at a single time and place, and has a clear definition of where that boundary is. If we're starting to get vague, like, hey, I consider everything kind of that way to be in this particular neighborhood, that's not what we mean by neighborhood. What we're getting at is like an apartment complex or a village or a planning area, or something that has a clearly defined geographic boundary, touches a particular landmark, a particular location, has a single developer who built that area out in a particular year. When we talk about neighborhood the other way, if we go to the next slide, we're really starting to think about how neighborhoods fit together to create communities of interest. Communities of interest are how neighborhoods come together around shared issues, shared characteristics, shared problems, concerns, shared need for representation. So, for example, we might say that a particular building that serves a retired community, that's a neighborhood. That individual structure, or maybe that set of homes that all have to be 65 and up to live in within them, that can definitely be a neighborhood. How that connects to its neighbors and other parts of the city, that's really getting at communities of interest. And so, for example, I know parts of some cities, like in Arizona, we're working with the city of Surprise that has several retirement communities that are all close to each other. That's certainly an example of how neighborhoods can come together to form a community of interest around the retired 65 and up community. And in fact, we heard a lot about the shared needs of the different retirement communities in that city. Similarly, we talk about that potentially with other factors as well. Areas that were built in the 1980s once served as a community of interest because it really contrasted with other development time periods within the city. And so certain neighborhoods had very different needs than others. And this is where we really differ. And this is where a lot of our discussion in that first and second round will happen. What are those shared characteristics, shared social impacts, economic impacts, shared policy areas of concern that unite areas together? And I really focus on the uniting. We can talk about where those clear divisions are as well, but let's think about the way we bring people together. And I know one of our anonymous attendees made this comment in the question and answer. Sometimes your residential community, where you think of as your community in terms of where you live, could be very different from the community you live at in terms of where you work. And I think we can all think of ways where our neighborhood, our little small island of within the bigger ocean, would connect to other neighboring areas, depending on how we're talking about it. Maybe it connects to the north in terms of our schools. But if we're thinking about the roads and the shopping centers and all of that, we really bond more with communities to the west or east. So this is going to be something that I want us to have a lot of discussion about, because this is something that is at the heart of the redistricting process or drawing districts process. If you go to the next slide, one way you can think about this, looking at the numbers, here are three measures that we often see as being common issues to discuss within cities. They're not the only ones. And as we get requests in for others, we'll show you where you can look at some of them online already, and where we're going to try to be pulling in additional data to help us understand the numbers. For example, multifamily housing on the left. This is what areas do we find apartments, condominiums, and other structures that house more than 2 families. Income in the center looks at what percentage of the population makes over 75,000. And child at home on the right, what percentage of households have children? And we can see how similarities might exist through these patterns, but also differences. And it's really going to be up to us to understand, or up to you to help us understand which patterns are relevant for our districting discussion and which are not. Let's go on to the next slide here, particularly when we're looking at a city with as comprehensive a development plan as Irvine has had. Things like zoning, land use, homeowners associations, planning areas, attendance areas, school district boundaries are undoubtedly relevant to understanding some of the neighborhoods in particular within the community. You know, I had one of our recent community forums, somebody asked, have you ever seen a city that's had as, you know, developed a planning system as Irvine? And, you know, I don't think I've seen one quite as developed as Irvine has, but our real question is, which of these planning areas are particularly relevant for understanding neighborhoods, and which ones don't do as good a job understanding our neighborhoods? That's a real question that I have, because some people have said just start with the planning area map, and others have said no, you've got to start thinking about certain larger communities than just the planning areas. And so that's the question we want to put out to you as part of this process. What is our building block that we should be looking at in terms of the city? Let's go on to the next slide. You know, so how do we do this? How do you share your feedback? How do you make sure that we hear it, the council hears it? Well, you know, what we really want to stress before I turn over to our website here in a couple seconds and demo the tools. I know Michelle Johnson has a question about how the tools work, and we're going to get to that here in a second. I really want to emphasize that we want to hear from you, however you want to provide feedback, whether it's a comment or come to an actual in-person live discussion and give your testimony in person to the council, or whether you just want to submit something to us electronically via email, whether you want to send us a whole map or just a comment about your particular neighborhood. We want to hear from you. And so we've put together a website that has a lot of different ways of looking at how to share information. And so I'm flipping over now to our district elections website for the city of Irvine, drawirvine.org, because drawirvine.org is a great location to go to find out about the process, where we are in the process, and how to participate. And in fact, we are continuing to make modifications and changes to the website based on your feedback. One of the things that I'll start with is our front of our page has great overview of the process. It also provides us our email address. districting@cityofirvine.org is the email you can send whatever you want to, whatever you want about the districting process to that box. You can let us know, you know, here's my map. You can say, I think these areas should be kept together. You can comment in, you know, in a very long extended email or something very short. districting@cityofirvine.org. In addition, on the webpage, we also have our schedule. As we continue to go through the process, we also continue to update our website. And so more information will be put here as we go along, including any official agenda and presentations, public comment reports to council. as well as additional information for each of the meetings. It doesn't take the place of the draft maps page. Once we start to have maps, these will go on the draft maps page. One of the nice features that we have is an interactive web viewer. In the future, you'll be able to draw or look at all the draft maps on this page as well. In the meantime, a lot of what I talked about earlier is actually on the map. So if you want to look into some of those demographics yourself, this interactive review map allows you to turn on and off layers. Like, for example, we want to see something like households with children. We can view that and zoom in and see more of that detail on than we could when we were looking at it zoomed out. If we want to see where we find more renters rather than owners, we can zoom in and get that information. As we've gotten requests, we've also been adding to this map as well. So for example, we had a request to look at density. Where do we see higher density concentrations of people living? And so we've added density in terms of population per square mile to the map as a result of feedback from one of these workshops. So if there's something you'd like to see, let's take a look and see if we can add it. Now, I know what a lot of you are interested in hearing about is the Draw a Map tool. And now we're going to go through a brief demo of the different options available. And of course, if you don't want to use a tool, we're happy to take anything you want to submit in writing, just about GMAPS in general. And that'll be, and I'll say as part of the process, us as a demographer firm will be looking at all of the different comments we've gotten to see what's been represented in the maps and what hasn't been. And anything not represented in the maps is something we're going to look at drawing into additional maps that we present to the council based on the feedback we receive. Now, we have two basic tools to help you draw your own maps. The first is a public participation kit. What we've done is we've divided the city into about 150 areas. Now, these are following major roads and planning area boundaries, but that's about it. We haven't really done much else in terms of those breakdowns. We think that these boundaries, they don't follow precincts precisely, but they do follow census block boundaries. What we hope to give you as part of this kit is an idea of the population within each of those planning areas, because some of the planning areas are quite large, up to 35 or even 40,000 residents. And so by breaking it up into smaller areas, we can see that, for example, although the university as a whole has a very high density of population, there's one area that has 56,000 or 5,600 residents, and another part of the university much larger, but only has 1,841 residents. I think these are just north of the university, actually. I think this is the San Joaquin Marsh. A lot of this is where we can really get into the weeds on where we see the highest density concentrations of people. And like I said, we've made an effort to follow the planning area boundaries to the extent that we can. So if you want to see how those planning areas break down into smaller areas, this kit gives you a really good way of doing this. One thing people often really like to do with this is just to color in an area and say, this is my community. Maybe not even caring about getting a balanced population district, just trying to highlight what the community is. And then we love those kind of maps as well, because even maps that are not population balanced or don't meet all the legal requirements can still help us and still help the council understand where those community boundaries are. So we have this kit available in Spanish, Arabic, Farsi, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese. We're merely making an effort to make sure that particularly this paper map is available in all the different threshold languages to make sure that we have, we could provide something, a handout to people from all different parts of the community. In addition to our paper tool, we also have Dave's redistricting. Now, I can't start talking about Dave's redistricting without kind of mentioning that this is a step up in terms of difficulty. It's not as easy to use as the paper tool or the simple Google Maps sort of interactive web viewer. But for those of you who want that block level detail, Dave's redistricting is a great resource for that. I have to start by saying we do have a short video introduction, about 5 minutes long, and we have a longer video introduction that's about 15 minutes long. If you want to refer to this video as well, you can do that. I'll walk you through the main steps, but our introduction and tutorial videos will also walk you through how Dave's works. The basic structure of Dave's redistricting is that you have to create an account. This is the place where a lot of people need to start. If you've never used the website before, this is what it'll ask you to do if you are completely logged out. It will ask you to log in or sign up. If you've never used it before, you just sign up with a username and a password. They don't put you on any mailing lists or anything, but they do need an account. And the reason you need an account is because as part of working through Dave's redistricting tool, you are going to be saving your map as it goes along. It's going to give you the option of sharing your map. It's going to, you're going to be sending us a link to your map. And having the account allows the system to save your map and make sure that it's available for you to come back to and modify and continue to make changes as you go through the process. Once you've set up your account, and I'll go back to the website, we have a template on the website that's basically just a blank map of the city of Irvine. It'll take a second to load. It's basically loading a lot of data to get here. It'll basically be completely blank. What you do is you may want to make an editable copy of the map first by clicking this little paintbrush that's next to the view only. Hit yes, and eventually it'll appear on your list of maps. It may take a few seconds in order for that map to appear. That's because it's copying a lot of data when it comes in there. You double click the map to get to it. Once you're here, you can click the name to change it. Give it a name. I like to do that first to make sure that I keep track of all the different maps that I'm making. Because believe me, once you get into this process, you're going to be making several maps before you settle on the one you want to send in. Now, as you see, it's all blank right now. If you want to turn on streets, then just click overlays in the bottom here, go to map. That'll add in all of those street names, those community names, things like that. You can zoom in either by zooming in here or by scrolling your mouse button if you're using a mouse. By default here, we're looking at the precincts of the city. Now, precincts are a great way to draw large areas. And so if I want to say, let's say I'm editing District 4, I click the paintbrush tool, and with a precinct, I can select those whole precincts to add to the district. Now, as I go along, it'll start adding those populations together. So I can see that I've added 6,000 people to my 4th district. That's all well and good if we want to add in large areas. But what if we want to add in smaller areas? Like, let's say I'm looking at this area right here in the middle of Woodbridge, and I want to add in just the community park, not the area around Woodbridge High School, but just the community park. And I'm not saying this would be a good district at all. I'm just doing this all for the purpose of example. Well, instead of precinct, I select block. And once I select block, I click on the precinct once, and it splits the precinct up into all of those different blocks. And let me go back a second. I'm going to turn on population. You turn on population by going into overlays, labels, and then let's just turn on the total population. So I can see that this whole precinct has 722 residents. When I select block and I select the precinct, I can now see how it divides up. So 377 of the 722 live in this one census block bordered by Alton Parkway, Lake Road, and San Diego Creek or the canal there. If I want to add in a block, I can select the block now individually. And here I am adding some of the blocks into my district. And then when I'm done, I just hit precinct again. And now it's divided that block. And now I can put Woodbridge High School into a different district than the rest of that precinct. Again, I'm not saying that this is a good map or a map that I would even endorse, but this is how the tool works. I will just note for the record that some of these block lines, if we click on the precinct, you can see that this block lines, sometimes they're a little bit, they don't quite follow the roads. Most of the time in this case, they're really meaning to follow the roads. This 88-person block really should follow Cedar Lake pretty much all the way around. It doesn't, because they're trying to save a little bit of memory and make your browser not crash. But if you have any questions about that in a specific block, I can tell you where those block boundaries are. It's in general, you can assume that they just follow the roads that are closest to it. You really only notice that if you're going into that level of detail. And so, again, just collect block, select your precinct that you want to divide, and then select the blocks appropriately. You may find that there's not a block boundary where you want there to be. If so, that's something you can certainly tell us in your comments, like, I really want to put the block boundary here, but I couldn't. Unfortunately, we're using what the census has as their census blocks that we're required to use as part of this process. Some of that may mean that in 2030, we're just going to have to work toward getting better blocks or blocks in places where we need them for the next redistricting. But Dave's Redistricting is our main browser-based tool for drawing districts at that block level. One of the nice things is that it does give you a lot of the demographic information, particularly on the racial demographics. You can also go into the statistics to look at your population deviation, to analyze your districts. And if you're into stats, there's some really good things in there about looking at the different statistics you can see for each of the maps. And then again, once we get all the maps and once, anything we receive will get posted to Draft Maps, whether it is a legal map or not. It's our commitment that any map we get is through like a Dave's email suggestion or whatnot will be published here. Now, last thing I should mention here, when you are done, when you finish drawing your map, you just go back to your list of My Maps, you select the map that you want to send to us, and then just hit share. When you hit share, you get this URL, this link to your map, and you don't have to allow editing. In fact, I would suggest not allowing editing. You copy this link, and then you go back to draw a map, and you email it to districting@cityofirvine.org. Just email us the link. You can also put in your email as much as you want about why you think your map is a great map. But we at least need the URL. Any comments you make, of course, will be published and will be presented alongside your map. But we need the URL in order to be able to draw your map in. So that tells us a little bit about Dave. Dave's, do we want to go back to the presentation All right, let's skip ahead a couple of slides. The presentation does have some reminders about the different tool options and about how they work, including the paper kit and Dave's. And so I think now we're going to move into our Q&A portion. I know we have a hand raised. How are we handling that, Nelson?
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and let the participant who has their hand raised, we'll allow them to speak. So I just allowed you to speak, Jessica. I just asked you to unmute as well. Okay, well then, hearing none from Jessica at this point, we can head over to our Q&A chats that we have here going. Just some feedback here. Justin, feedback is that we have, please take into consideration age in the community of interest because it varies. And then, we do have one more. I am allowing Mary Ann to speak here, and I've also asked you to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
This is Mary Ann Guido. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
I would like to know if you have access to the maps that are used by the community group called CERT, the Emergency Rescue Teams, that have been dividing up the city for emergencies. They've been a wonderful resource. I live in Turtle Rock. We haven't been evacuated since the 90s, but with the climate change and the wildfire, flood, and earthquake problems, we may feel close to our public safety volunteers on the community emergency resource teams. So my suggestion would be that we might want to reach out and see what maps they have used, since people have been experienced in the past, especially in the north part of the city, evacuations and preparedness for any kind of emergency.
No, that's a great suggestion. And I know that we have looked a little bit into that interface zone, but thank you for the organization name. We'll definitely reach out to them.
Thank you.
And if you do have a question, we do ask that you raise your hand in the raise your hand feature, or you submit your question using the Q&A feature. And we will give it another second or two. And then Justin, just to answer some questions that have come up from past workshops here, if you could just remind the public what happens to council members if they are in the same district after the districting process is complete?
That's a good question. So the important thing to remember, two things. No council member's term is cut short. So no matter where the council member ends up, they will continue to serve their district for the term, or not their district, but they'll continue to serve the city at large for the time that they were elected to. So any council members that were elected in 2020 2022, I should say, will have the opportunity to continue to serve on the city council until 2026, regardless of where they live or which district they live in. The second thing I will say is that it is up to the council at the end of the day to determine which districts are up in which election year. At least they will put it on the ballot as part of the ballot measure, which districts will be up for election in which year. So that'll be part of the debate and discussion that we have as we look at the draft maps and make those determinations about election year. You'll have the opportunity to vote on that as well as part of the vote on the measure as a whole.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. And then could you elaborate as to what the increase of district seats will look like and elaborate further on how they'll be able to vote moving forward?
Sure. And essentially we can think of the districting process as a bit of a rollout, so that in 2024, we would have the first two, how's the best way to explain this? Because we're doing two things at the same time, increasing the number of seats and switching to district elections. So if this is passed in the November 2024 election, 4 of the 6 districts would have the opportunity to vote for representatives. 3 of those districts would be ones that have a full term, 4-year term. 2 of those will be continuations of the current seats or the current council members. And then 1 of those will be one of the 2 new seats. Then the last seat that has an election is actually going to be for a short term, a 2-year term, and then we'll have another election in 2026. That is to make sure that we put 3 seats up in 2024 and 3 seats up in 2026. That will be the cycle going forward. For 4-year terms, 2024, we'll have 3. Those will re-elect in 2028. And the 2026 seats will re-elect in 2030, and so on.
Perfect. And then we do have one additional question in the chat here, which I can go ahead and answer. The question is, do you have another virtual session, or all future sessions are in person? And to answer that question, we do have one more virtual forum here that was going to be in the second half of the workshops that we have, which are starting in July. And the date for that is on the drawirvine.org website as we speak. And we do have quite a number of in-person workshops. Most of them are on the weekends. So if you're able to join one of the in-persons, feel free to do so, but we do have one more virtual workshop on our docket. And then, unless there's any other questions here, Justin, if you're good with it, I think we can head into communities of interest.
I'll just mention that it really has been due to community feedback that we've continued to adopt and make changes to the website and to the data that's available. I know I mentioned density earlier. We also have a map on the website showing the populations for the planning areas that came out of a specific request made in one of these workshops. We have also had a request for the population for villages, which are not quite the same as those community planning area boundaries. And we've been continuing to work on that with the city and with staff. But you know, we just want to emphasize that if you have something you'd like to see or comment on, we're happy to take that, like Mary Ann's comment earlier tonight.
Awesome. Well, then we can go ahead and switch slides and head into our community of interest conversation. At this point, we will turn it back to you, and it will ask you to engage in this process with us. On the screen here, you can see quite a few questions that we have for you to consider on what may identify your community of interest. For example, we'll leave the screen up before we switch over to another screen, but did want to give an example of some feedback that we've already gotten on communities of interest from our last 2 weekends of forums. One of the items that we heard from a resident was that a community of interest is those areas of the city that are the fire danger zones. So all of the areas of the city that are up against a foothill, or their neighbor or behind them is a fire danger area. And so therefore, because they all share the same concern, they all need to stay within the same district in order to get representation that carries their concern. And with that, we'll leave the screen up here for a couple more seconds. And then Kylie, I think we're good to switch over screens here. Awesome. And then using the same Zoom features, if you could go ahead and use the raise your hand, or if you even want to just chat your response here in the Q&A, and I can read them out loud. And then Kylie will live type all of your answers. That way you can see that they're being recorded. And then your answers will be posted to the drawirvine.org website after this meeting for all additional residents and community members to see what the communities of interest were. So I will give it a second here. I'll also give people a second to type their answers in the Q&A box.
And as people are thinking, I'll just address the one of the Q&A questions we just got. That we do intend on making sure that people are aware of the ballot measure, and that this is something that the council has decided to look at and place on the ballot as part of each presentation. I think we have a couple of slides at the beginning talking about that, and just want to mention that we will continue to do so throughout the process. Ultimately, want to emphasize that this will be up to the voters to decide whether or not districts are right for the city of Irvine, along with the expansion of the city council as well.
Okay, we do have one in the chat here, Kylie, so I'll read it out loud. The UCI and University Town Center planning regions both have a high proportion of university workers and students and should be kept together. So for the note there, we can say UCI and University Town Center planning regions. Give it a second. Okay. And someone put here Woodbridge, and I assume that would be North Lake and South Lake, and being able to keep that entire village in one planning region. And then we
Yeah,
also,
planning region in one district, yeah.
and then we also have here all non-Great Park area north of Irvine Boulevard. Thank you for putting the cross streets there. It's always super helpful when we can have clear identifiers. And then we also have the UC area, and then the Great Park area. And Michelle, not sure if you want to elaborate on that, but you did provide great feedback there.
And I'll also just add that if you don't want to say the whole thing out tonight, although we would love to hear from you if you do, you can always email us with further comments and elaboration on why that's a good community of interest to keep together. We love that kind of information.
Yes, definitely.
And we actually got a new one while we were talking.
We also have Woodbury Village. And then we also have just an item here, and more of a note that says, please do not lump the quote unquote poor corridors together.
And so that's a great one to kind of talk a little bit about, because if we just mean don't look at the income map and draw around income, that's great. We can definitely work with that. If there are specific areas you mean, like don't lump these two neighborhoods together simply because they're both lower on the income level, or maybe they both have a higher propensity of multifamily or rental housing, then the more detail we can get about those neighborhoods, the more we can look at that as a factor, and even the council can look at that as a factor when drawing those boundaries.
Definitely. Thanks, Justin. And then I'll give it another second or two for any final communities of interest, but just want to reiterate what Justin just said. If for some reason light bulb is not striking today, and tomorrow afternoon you're like, oh, this would be a great community of interest, please submit your feedback through the districting@cityofirvine.org email, and we'll be able to record all of your community of interest feedback there. And as I was talking, I did not see any additional feedback come in, so I think we can go ahead and switch screens back to the PowerPoint here. Awesome. And then we can head to the next slide. And then to more so close off our time here together, we did want to remind you, again, this is answering one of the questions that we just got earlier. We do have several workshops and forums still in the queue here. So we have 2 Saturday ones coming up in May, and that will close off the first round of the workshops that we have here. And they're at varying times, so hopefully you can make it out to one of those. And if not, like Brian said, please tell your friends, please tell them to get involved in this important once in a decade opportunity here. And then
I also add that we have our next public hearing on Tuesday, May 9th. So in addition to those 2 workshops, if you normally come out to our city council meetings, then we have a special item on redistricting at 6, and we'd love to hear from you then too. And
then to answer a question that just came in based off of these workshops, Correct. The first round of workshops will pretty much have the exact same content as tonight's session, but the community of interest discussion does vary. And so if you want to be able to be a part of that community of interest discussion from session to session, we do encourage you to attend. As you'll be able to essentially at the in-person workshops, rub elbows with your neighbors and fellow community members and be able to work off of each other and provide additional community of interest, as they may have a great idea and that spurs something else that comes up in you. So even if the meat of the content of today's workshop is relatively the same, the community of interest discussion is always different.
And of course, when we get into our second round, starting in July, the workshops will look a little bit different altogether, because we're going to really be emphasizing the maps and how the maps implement those communities of interest at those discussions. So all the ones we're looking at right now on the screen will look very different from this first round.
Awesome. And that's a great segue into highlighting our second round of workshops that we have highlighted here on the screen. Again, like I said, the second round of workshops is starting here in July, and that will be our second virtual webinar that we have. It'll be in the same format. So we do invite you to join that as well. And then we'll have a series and a slew of in-person workshops ranging from all over the city at that point. And then Kylie, if you could head to the next slide. And then just to wrap us up here, we do want all of your feedback. And even if you provided some feedback today, thank you. But if you have, like I said, a light bulb moment tomorrow and you're like, oh, this is another community of interest, we do want you to submit that through the email listed here. And also through that email, if you have any maps that you'd like to submit, like Justin said, it could be a partial map, could just be highlighting your community. We want to see that. And if you could be able to, if you would submit that through the districting@cityofirvine.org email address, then it'll be fully in the records and your map will be submitted to council consideration. If you are more old school and want to leave us a voicemail, we also have a phone number here that Trepepi Smith will respond to you via call in response to your voicemail. And then if you want to see this PowerPoint again, or any of the information or any of the tools that Justin shared today, that is on the dedicated website of drawirvine.org. And that is the one-stop shop for all of your districting information. And the email is also on there in case you are not able to write it down or jot it down today. And then Justin, any final words here as we close up?
Well, just because I know this question always comes up, we have had 7 map submissions as of today for our first round of hearings, and we look forward to seeing yours being added to that number as well. Thank you so much for attending today, and if there's any questions we didn't answer, please take advantage of all these methods to get in touch with us so we get them answered.
Oh, wait, let me check the chat one more time. All right, it looks like we are good. Well, thank you so much for everyone that has hopped on. And of course, we would love to hear more from you again. Thank you.